Now, here we have an uncomfortable question. Does the concept that 40K canon is flexible, because even real-world works of fiction set in the 40K setting are somehow subject to in-universe limitations of perspective and bias, help or hinder attempts to use canon to understand the characters? Well, here's how it helps. You get richer character depth by recognizing the bias and limited perspectives inherent in the 40K universe. That means that canonical stories or depictions of characters are not necessarily the entire truth. Every character or event is filtered through the perspective of whomever is telling the story, be it the emperor, a member of the Inquisition, a historian, a biased individual within a faction, or even implicit bias within an impersonal third-person narrative. This allows for a more nuanced interpretation of characters. For example, a story told from the point of view of a loyalist might paint a different picture of a traitor Primarch than one told by a more impartial or sympathetic narrator. It opens up the possibility that characters like Mortarion, whose early life is marked by hostility and horrible abuse, can also be seen through a lens of vulnerability, showing that we may only understand fragments of their full emotional experience. You can explore subjectivity with this idea. Characters in 40K, especially the Primarchs, are larger-than-life figures with many contradictory aspects. The narrative perspective allows for exploring multiple facets of a character's personality. For example, Horus is portrayed as both a tragic hero and a manipulative traitor in different sources from the Black Library, and understanding this duality is crucial for fully grasping his emotional journey. By acknowledging that 40K canon may not always provide a definitive, unbiased account, and maybe never does, we can dig deeper into the psychological motivations of characters and how their internal worlds conflict with the way they are perceived. And then this gives us potential for new interpretations. As a result of the subjective lens of different narrators, new insights and interpretations can emerge. This flexibility allows for a more dynamic understanding of characters, where new material or shifts in perspective, like new novels or codices, can add layers of complexity to previously well-understood characters. For example, the development of certain legions, stories, and personalities post-heresy might give us new ways to interpret their actions before the heresy, even if they were originally presented in a different light. This also allows us to ignore poor quality writing. The quality of novels from Games Workshop's Black Library can be, let us say, inconsistent. That's a nice way to put it. By deeming canon to be flexible, we can sweep stupid plot points and bad dialogue under the rug when it's convenient for us. And then it gives us room for character evolution. The flexible nature of 40K canon also gives room for characters to evolve. Mortarion's motivations, for instance, can be interpreted differently at different stages of his journey, depending on the perspective from which you approach his story. First as a hopeful leader of the Death Guard on his homeworld, then as a tragic and resentful traitor later. These shifts can reveal more about the core emotional needs of characters, as we understand more about how their relationships with others shape their personal development. Here's how it hinders our attempts to understand things. Obviously, you have problems with inconsistencies and confusion as a result of the canon not being one single canon. The multiple viewpoints and flexible canon can lead to inconsistencies that hinder a clear understanding of a character's emotional arc. With various depictions of events, motivations, and relationships, it becomes difficult to pin down what a character actually wants, feels, or believes. Mortarion, to keep that with that example, has been portrayed in different ways across various sources, sometimes as a proud, authoritarian figure, and other times as a tragic hero. This can confuse attempts to understand his emotional needs, because it's not always clear which version of the character we are meant to follow as canonical. It also gives us a problem with the inability to define a character fully. Given the many perspectives on each character, it's hard to pin down any one definitive understanding of their emotional landscape. While some might find this ambiguity liberating, others rightfully see it as a frustrating limitation. It becomes harder to create a single cohesive narrative for a character like Horus, who is presented as both a valiant leader and a betrayer, or Fulgrim, whose motivations seem to shift based on the narrator in each specific source. This ambiguity can leave gaps in our understanding of their emotional needs and personal growth. Then we have the problem of authorial intent versus player interpretation. The flexible nature of canon means that much of the narrative is left open to interpretation, but that could lead to problems when trying to discern the true intentions or character traits of certain individuals. The writers might present a character in one way, but the idea of subjective in perspective allows for a potential dilution of authorial intent. If each interpretation becomes equally valid, it can lead to the risk of losing sight of the emotional complexity which the author might have been attempting to convey, just as it also allows us to gain emotional complexity by ignoring stupid writing. Moral relativism becomes a concern. The idea that every character's actions are influenced by biased perspectives could lead to a kind of moral relativism, where any action, no matter how horrific, is explained away by their subjective experiences. This can hinder a deeper exploration of a character's emotional needs, as their actions could be justified based on their internal biases or the faulty perspectives of their own faction. It's harder to judge or understand a character's emotional motivations if every action is simply framed as the result of their biased perspective. Overall, the flexibility of 40K canon, with its varied viewpoints and unreliable narrators, can both enrich and complicate our understanding of characters and their emotional needs. On the positive side, it allows for multiple interpretations, deeper psychological exploration, and potential evolution for characters. On the downside, it can create inconsistencies and confusion, and may lead to a lack of definitive answers about character motivations and emotional arcs. Ultimately, whether it helps or hinders depends a great deal on how we approach the material. Acknowledging the subjective nature of these stories can give us more freedom to explore the emotional depth of the characters, but it can also make it more difficult to draw firm conclusions about their emotional needs and growth. Given the obvious inspiration drawn by the authors from Greek mythology, I think it likely that the flexible canon of 40K was designed as such specifically to mimic the way that much of ancient Greek mythology does not have a defined canon because of overlapping sources in antiquity. Apollo, as an example, was portrayed with different personality traits in sources from different city-states, times, or playwrights, sometimes quite honorable and right, and sometimes capricious and cruel. It's tough to say for sure whether 40K was designed with an awareness of the way that ancient mythologies, especially Greek, present overlapping, contradictory, and sometimes even bad examples of characters and stories. But it would be very consistent with how things have worked in canon, just as figures like Apollo, Zeus, or Heracles have been portrayed differently in different sources and cultural contexts. 40K characters and events are subject to varying interpretations and perspectives. This overlap and flexibility in sources allows for a range of possible characterizations and interpretations of 40K as a sort of Modern mythology, similar to how comic books function. Yes, there are also 40K comic books. Don't worry too much about it. So, parallels between 40K canon and ancient mythology. Multiple perspectives. Much like the diverse portrayals of gods and heroes in ancient myths, the characters in 40K are shaped by the biases and perspectives of those who tell their stories, both in-universe and different Black Library authors. Just as different city-states in ancient Greece might have had slightly different versions of the same gods. Each of the factions in 40K can present differing versions of the same events or figures. This allows characters like Horus, Sanguinius, or Mortarion to be understood multiple ways depending on the source. Horus might be seen as a tragic hero in one telling, and a manipulative villain in the next novel in the series. Similarly, characters in 40K can be portrayed with varying degrees of nobility or villainy depending on which author is telling the tale. There's some moral ambiguity and complexity that comes in here. In ancient Greek mythology, gods and heroes often embody contradictory traits. Apollo might also be the god of music and healing, as well as plague and destruction. These contradictions serve to make mythological figures more relatable and complex. Similarly, 40K's Primarchs and their legions often embody both positive and negative aspects, making them morally ambiguous. This ambiguity mirrors how those mythological figures, even those regarded as heroes, often have dark, destructive, or tragic qualities, notably Heracles. The very design of the Primarchs, each embodying aspects of both greatness and flaw, seem to echo this mythological pattern. There's deification and heroic paradoxes to consider. In Greek mythology, mortals sometimes ascended to godhood, blurring the lines between the human and the divine. The emperor, as a transcendent being who seeks to unify humanity, shares thematic parallels with mythic figures like Heracles or Achilles, who were both part mortal and part divine. The interactions between mortals and gods in these myths often revolve around the tensions between free will and fate, much like the struggles the Primarchs face between loyalty to the emperor and their own choices. This cyclical tension is part of what drives the narrative of 40K, with its larger-than-life heroes and villains constantly at odds with one another. There's cultural variability in myths. Just as Greek mythology evolved across different playwrights, poets, and philosophers, 40K is a shared universe that draws from a wide range of creators with different storytelling styles and focuses. This results in a variety of interpretations and expansions of the lore. In the same way that later Greek poets or playwrights might revise or reinterpret earlier, older myths, often with the goal of making the gods and heroes more relatable to contemporary audiences. Modern authors within 40K reinterpret and expand the mythos, often focusing on new themes or adding new dimensions to stories made in the early 90s. And then, as we mentioned, there's the creation of mythic space. The flexible canon of 40K creates a kind of mythic space where multiple interpretations of the same event or character can coexist without being fully reconciled or explained. Just as in Greek mythology, where conflicting versions of events are common, 40K's expansive and ever-evolving lore allow readers to approach the material from various angles, creating a space for personal interpretations. This encourages fans to think critically about the characters' motivations, beliefs, and the grand narrative of the setting. Sometimes fans don't do that, but at least they have been encouraged. And so we find that mythological storytelling, where contradictory versions of characters and events exist side by side, and where gods, heroes, and epic wars can be depicted in a multitude of ways, depending on cultural and narrative context, allows 40K to be a dynamic, ever-evolving fictional setting in which multiple interpretations of its characters and events can coexist, making it not only a rich storytelling medium, but also a place for readers and players to engage with mythic archetypes in a personal and interpretive way. I intend to take full advantage of this. In one of the 40K canon sources, the Ministorum has the verse, "The strength of the Imperium is the Emperor. The strength of the Emperor is the Imperium." Representing the health of a kingdom in the embodiment of its ruler, in the trope of the Fisher King, is an ancient narrative tool. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we will explore whether this tool is being used in 40K, spread out among the Primarchs. For example, the despotic law and order of the Arbites and the Assassinorum being linked thematically to the fallen Conrad Cours, and the violent ignorance of the Ecclesiarchy being linked to Lorgar. While the Emperor is the obvious central figure of the Imperium, his fractured dream and his failures as a father are reflected in the myriad dysfunctions of the Imperium itself. The Primarchs represent shards of the Emperor's vision, and perhaps, therefore, represent his failures. We can see the Primarchs as reflections of the Imperium's flaws. Just as the Fisher King's health determines the vitality of his land, the brokenness of the Emperor's sons echoes the institutions and culture of the Imperium. Here are some possible examples, which we will explore in greater depth later. Conrad Cours, with the Arbites and the Assassinorum, with themes of tyranny, fear, and unflinching enforcement. The Imperium's obsession with brutal law and order finds its shadow in Kurz's reign of terror on Nostramo and across the Great Crusade, and his belief in justice and order through fear. The Adeptus Arbites' draconian measures and the Assassinorum's ends justify the means philosophy feel like echoes of Kurz's moral absolutism become institutional. Lorgar, with, of course, the Ecclesiarchy, with themes of blind faith and the worship of symbols over ideals. Lorgar's fall to chaos came from his need to venerate and submit to higher powers. This same need manifests itself in the Ecclesiarchy's oppressive dogma, its elevation of superstition over reason, and its divergence from the Emperor's vision of a rational, secular imperium. We have Perturabo, reflecting the imperial bureaucracy, among other options. We'll look more into this later, with themes of endless labor and frustration at lack of progress. The labyrinthine, oppressive machinery of the administratum mirrors Perturabo's bitterness over being tasked with thankless and grueling campaigns. The Imperium's bureaucracy, much like Perturabo's fortresses, is massive and impenetrable, but devoid of soul or joy. Mortarion, perhaps reflecting the Inquisition, with themes of paranoia and relentless purging. Mortarion's hatred of psychers and corruption is echoed by the Inquisition's obsessive quest to root out heresy, often at the cost of innocent lives. His loathing of the warp becomes a paradox in the Imperium, where witch hunting leads to more destruction than protection, sometimes, and in which the very operation of the Imperium overall is dependent on psychers, notably navigators and astropaths. We have Fulgrim, with the noble houses and themes of vanity and excess. The insane decadence of imperial nobility parallels Fulgrim's worst descent into obsession with perfection and beauty. The glittering wealth of the nobles is a mockery of the Emperor's ideals, much as Fulgrim's fall was a betrayal of his quest for excellence. With Angron, perhaps we see reflected the penal legions, the punishment part of the Imperial Guard, with themes of exploitation and suffering. The penal legions of the Imperial Guard, their reliance on the disposable lives of criminals and unwanted people, echoes Angron's tortured existence as a gladiator. Both represent systems which perpetuate suffering for the sake of utility. And then, of course, we have the Emperor as the wounded king. The Emperor's literal entombment on the Golden Throne, a state of perpetual decay and torment, makes him the Fisher King figure par excellence, my favorite example of the trope in all of fiction. His inability to deal with his own emotional problems foreshadows his later physical wounds dealt to him by Horus. His failure to heal the emotional wounds of his sons and the divisions among them mirrors his failure to unite the Imperium as a harmonious entity. The Emperor's broken dream festers in institutions that enforce compliance but lack vision, compassion, or adaptability, while at the same time his body exists in a half-life on the Golden Throne, perpetually dead yet alive. The Imperium survives not because of its strength, but because of its inertia, a state that reflects the Emperor's own stagnation. His sons' flaws, magnified out into the Imperium's institutions, perpetuate a cycle of violence, fear, and suppression, making the dream of unity increasingly unattainable. For the mythological layer of 40K, by drawing on mythological archetypes like the Fisher King, 40K creates a thematic richness that underscores its grimdark narrative. The Primarch's legacies, both their virtues and their flaws, are not just personal stories. They are systemic. They are woven into the Imperium's very fabric. This parallel reinforces the tragedy of the heresy, the potential for greatness lost to misunderstanding, neglect, and pride. In the end, the Imperium reflects its creators, flawed, fragmented, and trapped in a cycle of decay. The question becomes whether its continued survival is truly strength or simply a prolonged death. The 40K setting, of course, was written by British people. Let us consider the Arthurian legends. As a literary device, the Primarchs draw from mythological British traditions surrounding King Arthur, who is said to return from Avalon to save Britain in its darkest hour. In the context of 40K, this theme aligns perfectly with the Imperium's narrative of decline, desperation, and the potential for renewal through the reemergence of its lost heroes, such as Guilliman and Lionel Johnson. There are some key parallels between Arthurian legend and 40K. The king in exile or sleep. In the Arthurian tradition, King Arthur is taken to Avalon after being mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, and there he enters a state of dormancy, awaiting the time when Britain will need him most. This concept symbolizes hope, continuity, and the idea that even in decline, salvation is possible. Some of the Primarchs serve as Arthurian figures. Many Primarchs have disappeared, gone into stasis, or otherwise left the narrative, with the promise of a potential return. Examples include Reboot de Guilliman, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Reboot de Guilliman, who slumbered in stasis until his miraculous healing in more recent canon, Lionel Johnson, who rests within the rock, awaiting the time when the Imperium needs him most. Lionel Johnson, resting within the rock, awaiting the time when the Imperium needs him most. Vulcan, whose perpetual nature makes him a living embodiment of the king who cannot die, with myths suggesting he will one day return to unite humanity and slay all the orcs or whatever. Jagatai Khan, who vanished into the webway, leaving behind the possibility of his eventual emergence. In Arthurian tradition, there's also the idea of the hour of greatest need. Arthur's return is prophesied to occur during Britain's darkest hour, symbolizing the restoration of order and the triumph of justice over chaos, lowercase c. This theme underscores the cyclical nature of decline and renewal. In 40K, the Imperium is perpetually teetering on the brink of annihilation, creating fertile ground for the Arthurian trope. The return of a Primarch often heralds a turning point or a rekindling of hope. Guilliman's return. Guilliman awakens at a time when the Imperium faces near total collapse, immediately stabilizing the situation as best he can and initiating the Indomitus Crusade. Lionel Johnson's return. His awakening signals a moment of renewed strength and unity for the Imperium, particularly in the ongoing war against chaos and the renewed threat of Abaddon in the light of the Cicatrix Maledictum. Vulcan's role. Myths of Vulcan suggest that his return may be after the salamanders collect a bunch of items of war gear he made. I don't know about that. Anyway, would unite humanity and reignite the Imperium's fading hope, akin to Arthur rallying Britain. In Arthurian tradition, there's the idea of the wounded king. The Fisher King, which we discussed earlier, is a central figure in Arthurian myth. In 40K, the Emperor is the ultimate wounded king, trapped on the golden throne, unable to die, yet incapable of leading directly. His wounds are mirrored in the decay of the Imperium, which stagnates and withers in his absence. Many of the Primarchs also reflect aspects of the wounded king archetype, most notably Guilliman and Lionel Johnson. The Arthurian legend of the king returning at the hour of greatest need is deeply interwoven with the Warhammer 40K setting, where the Primarchs serve as mythic figures. The Arthurian legend of the king returning at the hour of greatest need is deeply interwoven with the Warhammer 40K setting, where the Primarchs serve as mythic figures whose absences reflect the Imperium's decay and whose prophesied returns symbolize the potential for renewal. Each Primarch brings a unique thematic flavor to this archetype, from Guilliman's institutionalism to Vulcan's hope and Lionel Johnson's martial aptitude. These parallels reinforce the mythic tone of 40K, blending British literary traditions with the grimdark aesthetic of the setting. The setting of 40K is a horrible dystopia which is terrible everywhere for everyone. The setting of 40K is highly reliant on mythological parallels and allegories, but certain important myths and legends are not represented. Warhammer 40,000's mythological underpinnings are carefully curated to emphasize a particular grimdark message. The setting is not meant to be a utopia or even a hopeful vision of humanity's future. Rather, it serves as a cautionary tale, a dystopian mirror reflecting the consequences of neglecting genuine human connection, compassion, and balanced leadership. I posit that the choice of myths by the authors was done in order to hammer home the point that the setting is bad and not to be emulated. For example, the absence of a Jesus or Lao Tzu figure. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The intentional omission of uplifting archetypes. The absence of archetypes, such as a Jesus-like figure or a Lao Tzu-esque sage, is very telling. Traditional myths that offer hope, redemption, and harmony with nature or humanity are notably missing. Instead, the narratives of 40K focus on power struggles, decay, and the consequences of extreme, isolated authority. This is not an oversight, but a deliberate choice by the authors to underscore that the future portrayed is one to be avoided rather than emulated. They're using myth as a warning. By relying on darker mythological parallels, the tragic heroes, the cursed kings, the fallen angels, the setting emphasizes the destructive outcomes of neglecting the emotional and spiritual dimensions of leadership. The dystopian reality of the Imperium, with its endless war and oppressive bureaucracy, reflects the idea that a society built on cold pragmatism, expediency, and isolation ultimately sows the seeds of its own ruin. The implicit lesson is that without compassion, empathy, and genuine human connection, even the most powerful regimes are doomed to decay. The cost of emotional neglect is seen. Many of the Primarchs, as well as the Emperor himself, are portrayed as figures who sacrifice their humanity, at least in the emotional sense, for the sake of order, control, or survival. This sacrifice, while intended to forge a strong, unyielding empire, instead resulted in a legacy of wounded, isolated leaders whose personal tragedies mirror the overall dystopia of the Imperium. The absence of figures who might have embodied healing, reconciliation, or deep spiritual insight, like a Christ or Lao Tzu figure, reinforces the idea that the costs of such sacrifices are enormous and long-lasting. This is a deliberate narrative choice. In essence, Warhammer 40,000's narrative choices are designed to hammer home a central theme. A society or a future built on isolation, authoritarianism, and emotional neglect inevitably devolves into a nightmarish dystopia. The exclusion of myths and legends that emphasize hope, communal care, and the transformative power of compassion is a deliberate signal. It tells us that this is a universe where the failure to nurture our shared humanity has led us to a reality where darkness prevails. Ultimately, while traditional uplifting myths offer models for how we might aspire to live and govern, the Warhammer 40,000 setting warns us that abandoning these principles in favor of cold necessity and expediency produces a future that is much a cautionary tale as it is tragic.